Evening, everybody, and welcome to the FASD Hub Scotland's Wednesday webinar with David Junior Gilbert. Welcome, Gilbert. So just a little, I'm sure most of you know this, but I'm just going to give him the introduction that he so duly deserves. We're really pleased to have Gilbert with us. We're delighted that he agreed to come along and do this webinar for us. So David Junior Gilbert is an interdisciplinary PhD researcher and hourly paid lecturer in the School of Health and Society at the University of Salford. Gilbert is a member of the academic network of Her Majesty's Prisons and Probation Service, Neurodivergence in the Criminal Justice Network, Salford FASD Research Group, and is also a contributor to the Research and Enterprise Committee at the University of Salford. Gilbert, as he prefers to be known, that's what he told me, is passionate about increasing the knowledge, understanding, and awareness around the vulnerabilities of individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and within the criminal justice system. Gilbert's recent study was exploring vulnerabilities of individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders to and within encounters with the criminal justice system. I was lucky enough to be able to have my daughter take part. I know probably many of you on this evening's webinar were also able to take part, and I think we're all very thankful for Gilbert's research, very pleased that he's come to share some of his findings and talk to us openly. So I would encourage you to type any questions that you have in the Q&A. We have pre-submitted questions that post Gilbert's presentation I will ask him and he will feed back. Along the way, we will also keep an eye on what's coming up in the Q&A. The chat is active, so if you want to communicate in the chat with each other, feel free to do so. And with that said, thank you to Gilbert. I'm going to hand over to him now. Enjoy his presentation, and we'll be back a little bit later with some questions. Thank you, Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Joe. You really made me a bit tensed with that introduction. I just hope I live up to the expectation. But
you will. You'll be fine.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I think we've got Anne says she can't see anything. I don't know if it's the network, but I just want to seize the opportunity to say a very big thank you first for the opportunity to be here. It's always a pleasure, always a privilege, always an honor to talk about FASD, to share my research and sort of have an opportunity to discuss some of the implications really. I want to first of all start before I share my screen. I don't want to forget this. This is really important to me. I just want to thank FASD Hub Scotland and many of the families who are here this evening, those who are not able to make it, who have really taken time to provide input into the research I'll be sharing today. Several other organizations too have really contributed, and it's been really inspirational to see the passion from parents, the passion from families, wanting to give their young people with FASD an opportunity to a better life. You really inspire me. You give me the courage, the passion to keep going with this research. Thank you. At this point, I will share my screen, if that's all right. I've just got a few slides which I would want to share with you all. I hope you can see my slides, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine.
Yep. So today I've sort of titled the presentation Individuals with FASD and Suggestibility During Police Interviews. I'm sorry, it sounds like a mouthful, but I'll take my time to explain all of these terminologies, especially in the light of the results from my PhD research. As Joe said, I'm actually a PhD researcher within the School of Health and Society here at the University of Salford. And with this research, I declare that there's no conflict of interest. I didn't receive any funding for the research, except for a small amount which the NHS Trust in Surrey actually provided, that we then ran a participant prize draw with. So as a general overview, I wanted to just sort of give us a bit of context before we then go into exactly what the outcomes of the research have been carrying over the past over 3 years and a half thereabouts. And firstly, just to provoke our minds to understand that yes, the criminal justice system as we know it is actually a network of agencies comprised of several agencies that work together to administer justice. And really, we know again by literature that actually it is more of a process that leads from the first encounter where probably the law enforcement or the police encounter the suspect, witness, or victim of crime, and then it moves onward depending on the outcome of each stage. It keeps proceeding. Now, I've slightly mentioned in the overview that really the encounters with the justice system could either be as suspects of crime, as victims of crime, or as witnesses of a crime. Now, these are the three general forms of encounter individuals really have with the justice system. And just to make it clear again, that for each of these varied forms of encounter, the dynamics, the expectations, and the outcomes of each of these encounters actually are different. So the kind of interaction that goes on actually takes a different form depending on the form in which an individual encounters the justice system. This informs many times the questioning style. Sometimes it even involves the approach interrogators will take to speak to the individuals concerned. Again, from research, and this was a systematic review conducted by Popova and colleagues, mostly from studies conducted in Canada, Australia, and the US, which we all know in the field of FASD are very much advanced when it comes to FASD research, especially within the justice system. And one thing we know, one very striking, punching output from that systematic review is the fact that individuals with FASD are actually 19 times, it says to some extent between 19 and 40 times more likely to encounter the criminal justice system. And we all know and agree that one of the very first points, one of the crucial steps in these encounters is investigative interviewing. Now, the question at the start of my PhD was, well, if individuals with FASD have a higher likelihood of encounters with the justice system, we are not saying everybody would encounter the justice system, but is the more likelihood due to their vulnerabilities. And we know that investigative interviewing is crucial to this step or to the encounters. Then the first question that popped into my mind as an independent researcher is, what exactly do we know about the performance of individuals with FASD when they encounter the criminal justice system? This led me to undertake a systematic review, which thankfully was published. And if you have the time, if you consider it useful, please just search it online and you will see the paper that was published. From this paper, from the systematic review, we realized that really nothing is known essentially about this form of encounters or this step during justice system encounters. I only found two papers. The first one was a paper that discussed the encounters of individuals of FASD, but it had only 7 participants. The second paper was a case study that involved one person, and the author sort of unraveled all the tactics interviewers were using to extract information from this individual. Then we then broadened the search to sort of include papers that talked about the wider vulnerabilities of individuals with FASD. Please take the time if you consider it useful to see this paper. Now, from that systematic review, we then decided, or I decided rather, to look at, first of all, based on the existing evidence, we know they are over 19 times more likely to encounter the justice system. Now, the question was, what are the factors that predispose the FASD population to this higher likelihood of encounters with the criminal justice system, and what are the factors that may contribute to an unfair outcome during investigative interviews. Now, just to be clear again, we know again by literature in law, forensic psychology, and criminology that many times there's an over-reliance of the output from investigative interviews, and it impacts a lot of time what the sentencing will be. So what you say at that point of investigative interviews many times, is used to sort of influence and impact the outcome of that encounter. In order to answer or to sort of satisfy or find answers to the aim of this research, I did design a two-phase study. Now, the first phase was a qualitative phase, and this is what is represented here at the left side of my screen, is the qualitative studies, which thankfully some of the families listening this evening actually kindly participated. So what we did at that point was I interviewed parents of individuals with FASD and also the young people with FASD to find out their perceptions, to find out what they think are the factors that predispose them to this higher likelihood of encounters with the criminal justice system. Now, from the findings of that phase, from the qualitative studies, I fed the feedback we got into a quantitative phase, which is phase 2, and I psychologically assessed them using psychological instruments. It was a psychological assessment study to sort of triangulate the findings. So they've said certain factors, sort of lead them to encounters with the justice system, and then in the second phase, we then experimentally measure these factors, and these are the results I'll be sharing this evening. My focus will majorly be on phase 2 of the studies, but I will just briefly describe what we found in the first phase. Now, the first phase interviews with parents, we found out statements like, well, they quickly go downhill into the justice system. And what that theme was actually reflecting all the vulnerabilities of individuals with FASD. Parents talked about how their children will only think after acting. They talked about how their children had lost the connection between cause and effect. Then we also found some of the parents talking about how they were bearing the brunt of society's ignorance. So basically, many of them were impacted in their careers, in their professional lives, just because society did not understand FASD. Then we had parents reporting how we need more FASD aware systems. And lastly, I couldn't just ignore the fact that parents also highlighted the talent and strength of their young people. Then onto the interviews with the young people, we see where I had a conversation with them, recorded conversations, and analyze the data. And we see that the young people talked about some of the personality and individual triggers to justice system encounters, where they talked about how impulsive they think they are, or rather they are. Statements like, I just take things, I don't think about it. Statements like, I inevitably just would get in trouble in one way or another. I mean, these were really emotive sessions, these were touching sessions. Hearing the narrations of both the parents and the young people, I think as a researcher, or as an independent researcher, when you sit to listen to these sessions, you definitely will go away thinking that, look, more needs to be done about FASD and the justice system. Yes, then moving on to phase 2, which will be really the focus of the webinar this evening. Based on the findings from phase 1, we then started asking, because parents, they tell us, the young people, they tell us, or tell me rather, that really they were being manipulated by friends. They were very, very prone to accepting suggestions from friends and peers. And the first question was, how suggestible are those with FASD compared to those without FASD? And what we did with that was we had a group of young people with FASD whom we labeled the FASD group. And then we had the second group of young people of the same age who were neurotypical, in the sense that they didn't have a diagnosis of FASD, they didn't have a diagnosis of any neurodevelopmental disorders, and we wanted to compare the level at which these two groups would accept suggestions during investigative interviews. Then the second question I did ask was, what's the relationship, in terms of some of the factors we got from the first phase? For instance, we heard how young people with FASD had poor memory, were impulsive, had low awareness of cause and effect, and their suggestibility, how these factors impact them. So these were the two questions I posed for the second phase. How did we collect the data? How did I go about collecting this data? So firstly, the young people I worked with were between the ages of 11 and 16 years old. They were 52 in total, and there were no difference. There was no significant difference between their ages. So they were really very comparable. Now, I conducted psychological assessments. The first assessment was IQ. I used the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children to sort of understand the IQ levels between the two groups. Then, secondly, I used a tool known as the brief to measure impulsivity and executive functioning. So, this tool actually takes the perception of parents, of the young people themselves, and teachers, who will then feedback to say, well, we see how impulsive this young person is. And I will describe all of the results as we go along. I know I have 30 minutes. I could talk about this forever, but I'm going to be disciplined. I promise. I'll try to fit it in as much as possible. Then I measured interrogative suggestibility, which I think I defined in the previous slide here. Interrogative suggestibility is the extent to which, within a closed social interaction, people come to accept messages communicated during formal questioning. And it's a definition given by Professor Gisli Gudjonsen, who is a world-renowned forensic psychologist. I had the privilege, along the course of this research, I had the unique privilege of talking to Professor Gisli. He actually formulated the Gudjonsen suggestibility scale. It's a standard tool used in forensic settings. He has used this tool in several cases within the justice system to actually demonstrate vulnerability of people who have been incarcerated or accused of crimes. Then we extracted memory too from the Gudjonsen suggestibility scale. So right away now, we'll delve into the results. Let's talk about what we found out. Let's talk about what I saw. Let's talk about exactly what the comparisons were between these two groups. So firstly, I would present the result on intelligence quotient that is measured by the WISC, and you could see clearly that there's actually a difference. So if you look at the mean, that is the average score between the control group, this is the group without FASD, and then if you compare that to those with FASD, you can see that there's quite a significant difference, in the sense that the control group has an average IQ of 116 averagely, while the FASD group had much more lower IQs. And I hope we find the time this evening to talk about what the implications of this actually looks like. Then I then move on. I hope this slide is clear enough. And this is measure, or this is the output, the results from the impulsivity and executive function assessments. And the key to understanding this actual result is, firstly, I highlighted the results of the FASD group in red. And clearly, this tool, once you have a higher score on this particular tool, it actually depicts higher impulsivity. So the higher you score, the more impulsive it means you are. And you can clearly see nearly on all measures. So BRI is a measure of the ability of the young people to regulate their own behaviors. ERI there stands for how the extent to which they can actually regulate their own emotion. And then finally, GEC, which is Global Executive Composite, talks about executive functioning in general. And what we can see from all the results here is that the individuals with FASD seem to actually score higher on nearly each measure. And what is the key here? So any score that is actually less than 60 is in the normal range. Any score between 60 and 64 is mildly elevated, and then scores that are between 65 and 69 actually tell us that the impulsivity of the individual is potentially clinically elevated. And then lastly, for any T score greater than 70, it is outrightly clinically elevated. And if you look at the results here, the mean of each of these, you can clearly see that the individuals with FASD were actually between the clinically elevated range or the potentially clinically elevated range compared to controls. And again, like I said, these results were actually a triangulation. Triangulation means getting, the same assessment from different points. So we assessed it from the parent standpoint, from the standpoint of the individual, and from the standpoint of the teachers. So you can see clearly for self, the individuals told us themselves how impulsive they were. The parents confirmed the same, and we had the teachers also providing similar results. I hope that's clear, but please feel free, like Joe said at the introduction, to just pop in your questions. I will do my best as much as possible to provide answers to the best of my ability. So then finally, we come to the part where actually provides my unique contribution to the field of FASD. Now, and that is in the form of the assessment of interrogative suggestibility. And like I defined it at the outset, interrogative suggestibility actually just defines the extent of acceptance of suggestions during police questioning when interrogators within the criminal justice system interrogate or question suspects, victims, or witnesses of crime. But at this point, I would just clarify that my PhD research has actually focused on the encounters of individuals with FASD as suspects of crime. So, firstly, we actually had a number of assessments. We had a number of measures we assessed. So, firstly, we measured immediate recall. Now, I'm going to explain how this process is. I know this slide has a lot of technical terminologies, but I just want to spend the next few minutes really digging deep to explain how we obtained each of these scores. So, firstly, I'm mindful of the time too as well. So, firstly, what we did was we actually called the young person in. I called the young person in, and I tell the young person a short story. The story is less than a minute long, and in that story, there are actually 40 facts contained. And I said to the young person, as soon as I finish telling you this story, please tell me back what all you remember, what you can remember. And clearly, you can see the control group, out of 40 points, they could actually remember 16 points correctly. But then when it came to the FASD group, they could only remember 5 points. Now you can see that the difference was actually very significant. So when you look at the significance, any p-value less than 0.05 tells us that the margin is really significant and you can't ignore the performance. Now, immediately the young person tells me back the story I told them. I then give them a break. I give them 50 minutes break. I say to them, go and have a drink, go and walk around, just take some fresh air and come back to me. As soon as they come back, I then ask them, can you tell me that story I told you shortly before the break? All that you can remember. Now, with that delayed recall, we clearly see that the individuals with FASD actually remembered averagely only 5, while those without FASD remembered as much as up to 15 points. Now, the next item we could measure from these assessments is confabulation. What is confabulation? This is just when individuals with memory problems will fill in their, the spaces they can remember with imaginative stories. Now, on immediate assessment, I would explain what went on here. You could see that really there were comparable results, but I will show you what happened later. Now, the next item I measured was yield one. So after they've told me back the story they remember as much as they can remember, I then asked them about 20 questions. Now, in those 20 questions, 15 of them are actually things that never happened in the story. These are questions that sort of try to feed in suggestions to the young person. So for instance, the story I told the young person was about a young boy riding on a bicycle and his brakes were broken. But when it comes to asking them the questions, I will say things like, was there a van coming down the hill? And then all some of those questions were just meant to see if they would accept the suggestions. I will just be clear at this point that we had ethical approval to just explain all the process to say, well, this tool actually has a measure of trying to say to the young persons things that never existed. Now you could see that is the measure of yield. The young people with FASD clearly, significantly, much more, nearly twice, nearly two times more, accepted those false suggestions compared to the controls. Now, as soon as they finished telling me their answers, I said to them something like, oh, you've made a number of mistakes in the answers you gave me. Can we go over the questions again? And then as soon as we go over it, I then am able to capture if they actually accepted the suggestions. And as soon as they receive the feedback, the negative feedback, we can clearly see that they did actually accept the suggestions much more than the individuals without FASD. So, in practice, what this meant was the individuals without FASD would clearly say to me, no, that was not in the story. You didn't mention that, Gilbert. This is not part of the story. Meanwhile, the individuals in the FASD group did accept the suggestions. Then the next measure was shift, I assessed. And shift here just means at the point where I say to them, there's a mistake in the answers you've given me. Can we go over the questions again? Try and be more accurate. Now, at that point, what I am measuring as I repeat the question, one thing I'm measuring again is the fact or the extent to which they shift their answers from a yes to a no or from a no to a yes, just sort of that bit of changing answers based on the negative feedback. And clearly, you can see that the individuals of FASD did actually shift their answers back and forth compared to those without FASD. I hope I'm not too fast. I hope this is clear enough. But these are some of the measures we found. Then at the end of the day, what we could calculate from all of this is total suggestibility. And total suggestibility is a sum of yield one, which is the acceptance of suggestion before negative feedback, and shift, which then gives us the total level at which they can be suggestible during investigative interviews. And clearly, you will agree with me that it's quite a very wide margin when it comes to suggestibility. Here, lower scores in immediate memory recall actually denotes poor memory, like we've shown here. And these are some of the measures we found. Now, after all of this, when we did it immediately, I said to the young person, can you come back, please, and speak to me after 1 week? And I'll show you the results of the 1 week assessment. Now, the idea behind the 1 week assessment is um, technically or in practice, we know the criminal justice process does not finish in 1 day. You are being called back to repeat what exactly happened, to provide statements, and that is exactly what we tried to mimic by saying, okay, you go and come back after 1 week and speak to me, and then I will show you what those results actually showed. So the other slides just, sort of reiterate what I've all explained to you just now. Um, Yes. So delayed suggestibility after 1 week. So, like I explained, after immediate assessment of all of these measures, we spoke to the young people to say, look, go and come back after 1 week. And these are the results we found. As soon as they came into the room, I asked them, can you tell me that story from 1 week ago? And clearly, we can see that there was a drop in what they could remember significantly, because the individuals of FS, they only remembered 4 points on average, or 5 points when we round it off, compared to 13 points the individuals without FASD could not remember. The same thing happened for yield and shift and total suggestibility. The margins were actually highly significant. They told me the story. I asked them 20 questions, 15 of the questions being suggestive questions, and the individuals with FASD accepted nearly 8 or 9 of those suggestions, while those without FASD could clearly identify the error in the questioning. They will say, no, Gilbert, that was not in the story. That's not true. That was not mentioned. Now, I've cycled confabulation here because if you remember when I showed you the immediate results, we could see that there was a bit, sorry, I'm trying to get it now. There was a bit of a comparable result in confabulation. And what happened is after 1 week, when you called them back, the individuals of FASD seems to confabulate even more compared to those without FASD. A few things happened here. We realized that though the difference in terms of significance was not very wide, but clearly you can see a tendency to higher confabulation in individuals with FASD after 1 week. And this has grave implications for justice system encounters. I hope this has been clear enough, but I'm ready to take questions and we can sort of discuss more of some of the psychological mechanisms or some of the pathways, what was going on underneath some of these results. Now, at this point, I always like to do this when I present some of these results, is for us to take a bit of a pause. I know it's a lot of information being thrown at you, but just to sort of think about the significance of some of the results we've just seen. So firstly, I would say all the results, all these assessments were conducted remotely. So the young people were sat at home, their parents were supporting them. It was over the internet, so there was no face-to-face interaction. And this has grave significance because in real life situations it will be much more different. The uncertainty, the interrogative pressure will be more. And if we can find this level of suggestibility, I think it is worth spreading the news, spreading the information to the justice system professionals about the vulnerability of individuals with FASD during justice encounters. Now, imagine what this real scenario will produce. After 1 week delay, we had more yielding, we had more confabulation. What would happen after 2 weeks? What will happen after 3 weeks? What will happen after 1 month? These are some of the questions that sort of, bother our minds when we look at this result. Now, just the contribution to knowledge. Firstly, this is the first study globally to measure this interrogative suggestibility in young people between the ages of 11 and 16 years old. We had one study in the US, but it measured in only 7 adults, and those adults, there was no comparison to actual controls. So somehow, the results here show to us or sort of provide an insight into the degree of vulnerability in during police interrogation, if I would say. I think at this point, I believe I've sort of gone beyond my timing, but yes, thank you
Gilbert,
so
it's
much.
fine.
This
It's
is
fine. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, we've definitely got a lot of questions that have already been submitted pre tonight's webinar, and we've also got questions coming in. So I think everybody would agree it's very, very informative, and thank you so much for giving up your time and sharing that with us. I would encourage anybody who has questions that they would like to be asked this evening to type them in the Q&A. I'm going to ask Gilbert the questions that we've had this evening and then go through a lot of the questions that have been submitted in the lead up to this. So there was a question that came in, Gilbert, and it was a question I'm grappling with, is whether the level of suggestibility becomes more entrenched over time, especially when an individual is in sort of flight mode.
Yeah, I mean, this is really going to push me to talk so much about what the literature has shown. So, firstly, what we've seen based on this research is the fact that yes, firstly, after a delay, we see higher confabulation, but there are so many factors that sort of lead to that. So one of the factors is what is known as memory distrust syndrome, and that is when people have poor memory in interrogative context, they tend to sort of rely on external cues to respond to interrogators, and that is really dangerous. That is really incriminating, self-incriminating, because if you rely on external cues at that point, then interrogators can sort of just shift it the way they can. So potentially the results have shown this vulnerability, but I'm also interested to see what would happen after 1 month, what would happen after 2 months, because of course we know the justice system process does not just end in one day. I hope that has answered the question.
Somebody else just said, what would the impact of the higher stress level, like the fight, flight, sympathetic nervous system induced by the police station be on the outcome? So if they're in that like really heightened state,
yeah,
would that potentially change?
So 3 factors as highlighted by Gudjonson actually impact suggestibility. Firstly is high level of uncertainty. So firstly, there's that level of, I don't know what's going to come out of this, that tension, the pressure, then the level of trust. If there's that level of distrust, the young person is at that stage where they don't even trust the people around them, and then the level of expectation. So these 3 factors we know impact suggestibility greatly. One thing, like I mentioned, with these researches, we did it all at home. It was all remote, and then we've seen this high level of suggestibility. Potentially, we want to theoretically assume that in a real life situation with these high levels of uncertainties, you've got justice professionals in their uniforms, as you know, the police and whatever. We think that would increase on uncertainty, and definitely it may lead to higher suggestibility.
Okay, fabulous. How do I protect and support my child, age 14, who has already been in contact with police as he gets older?
Yeah, I mean, this is really difficult. I think one of the things that comes off of my research is actually the zeal to run with what we found as experimental evidence to show to the police, to show to justice professionals that look, yes, theoretically we've had a lot of papers that say these people are vulnerable, people with FASD are suggestible, but here's the research evidence. So I think with increased awareness, hopefully things will get better, and as a society we would be able to take a different approach that will ensure that justice is served. Now that's the focus of my post-PhD work, just to look for that partnership with the police force and justice professionals to sort of ensure that this awareness goes out, and young people, like for the example we've had, can have that level of protection. I hope that has helped.
Yeah, so, someone asked us, could councils across the country find a way to support individuals with FASD in such a way that there wasn't a battle of budgets and not causing so much stress? Do you think like individual councils could work and support?
Yeah, this is of course my personal opinion. Is just based on the literature, what I've seen. I think it comes based on the understanding of um, it's like the cost effect, when you look at balancing the cost and effect. So in the long run, if we don't do what we need to do headlong with awareness about FASD, we will be spending more going forward. And permit me, sorry, to just bring an example. I had a situation where I had to write an expert report for a young person with FASD, and one of the arguments in that report to the judge in that case was, well, it's not in the public interest, it's not in the interest of the government spending to administer interventions, say within prison settings, to people with FASD when it's not tailored to meet their needs. So all we'll be doing is we'll be backing at the wrong tree, spending more money in the long run if we don't deal with the situation headlong. And it's really important for practitioners and policymakers to understand this, because at the end of the day, we know first of all that drinking in pregnancy is over 40% here in the UK, which increases the chances of FASD in the society. And the recent study from the Salford FASD research group also showed that we have nearly 2% in Greater Manchester. So some of these things, taking it into cognizance, I think once policymakers and decision makers know of the impact of this, I believe it will not really be so much of a battle to confront this immediately. This is what I think.
That's everybody's got their fingers crossed, I think, that, don't you? Everybody's going, yes, please. So did you get any indication, this is another question that came into us, did you get any indication as to any differences with the online risk compared to doing an in-person one?
Oh, thank you. Brilliant question. Thank you for that question. And I was really curious about that because the PhD started off at the beginning of the lockdown. And one of the biggest challenges I had was actually trying to conduct these assessments, which then led us to, it led me to settling for the online assessments. Now, for some of the parents who came into the study, I was curious. As soon as they told me, well, my child has done the risk face to face, I will say to them, please, can I have, can I have an idea of the results you found with just to compare? And really, honestly, we didn't find so much difference. It was a bit of +1, -1, +2, -2 in terms of the scores. And really, evidence-based research evidence has shown that actually tele-assessment, that's remote assessment, online assessment, the results are comparable with face-to-face. I got references from a lot of researchers who had compared results even before my own study. So I would say the differences really were insignificant with face-to-face and the remote ones.
Oh, good. Right. So this is a question that came in that I'm really interested in as well. So how do you plan to share the results of your research with like the police in Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland? And might there be eventually online training models on understanding FASD specifically for the criminal justice system? Maybe this is something we need to talk about, Barbara. She's somewhere in the background. At both sort of initial police training, you know, when they first come in to train as a policeman, or to ongoing CPD. Is that something that would be something you would think about, or how do you plan to get those results out to the police?
So I mean, this is really important. This is a really big question. I've actually made effort to talk with officers and men of the police force, and I found that really there's been a level of positive response in the sense that firstly, I will be speaking at an evidence-based police conference, and this will be in a few weeks' time in Cumbria. And we also have, fortunately, a partnership with, the police force at the University of Salford, where officers come in for training and have been speaking to the module leaders who have really shown interest in wanting to share this knowledge. So, I mean, any contact at all within the justice system would be helpful. I'm more than happy anywhere, any day, anytime, anyhow to just share this. And because the essence of this, Joe, and I think you agree with me and our listeners this evening, is to make society do better. Just to approach things differently. And this is one thing I've really learned from my research, rather than taking an accusatory tone, just the way we deal with the issue of stigma with FASD, we want to take a partnership approach to say, well, there's research evidence to say within the justice system, there's possibility of, FASD, and how can we do to get things better. Yes, educating solicitors too. I've seen that comment, really important. And I'm happy if there are contacts that will be helpful to just, sort of engage with professionals. I think it's just that snowball effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
To just get, yeah.
So in terms of what would be your sort of assessment of the level of awareness of FASD amongst the people that are working within the judicial system that you've spoken to date? How would you assess, with no training, just you coming in talking, how would you assess their level of understanding?
Well, I would say really it's quite low, to be honest, because we've had these conversations over and over again, and I feel like more needs to be done just because of the likelihood of those with FASD to encounter the justice system. So I think I'll make reference to a study published by Professor Raja Mukherjee. I think he was a survey of professionals, over 500 professionals, and one of the strongest theme was the lack of knowledge. I mean, within professional circles of FASD, its impact, I mean, the possible outcomes for those with FASD.
Okay, somebody's just sent in a question saying they noticed that the upper IQ of the neurotypical group was 135 and wondered how sensitive the average was to one or two people in the group with a high IQ, and just wondered what the sample size was for each group.
Yeah, so we had a total of 52 participants, 27 were in the test, while 27 were in the FSD group and 25 was in the control group. One of the things I think we have seen is the fact that in terms of the IQ, we know we've had studies also that have investigated IQ in comparing those with FSD and those without FSD, and with much more larger sample sizes, and we realize our results sort of are comparable with those. And permit me to also mention, I know this is a bit of a diversion. I think one of the things that has come off of my PhD is the fact that in terms of some of the legislations that have been promulgated or proposed to protect vulnerable people, many times the access, or rather the standards for accessing support in terms of mental capacity is set at 70. But if you see the results we had in the FSD group, it was at 82. That was the average. And this actually points to something. Despite all the vulnerabilities that have been evidenced in this research, you could see that the IQ was still above that 70. And permit me to also mention that the suggestibility levels we found is actually comparable to those with intellectual disabilities. So people with intellectual disabilities clearly have IQs that are, below 70, thereabouts, but then they would be sort of, they would lay claim, legally to mitigated sentencing when it comes to justice system. That's mitigated sentencing in terms of, reduction in sentences due to their mental capacity. But we've seen the same level of suggestibility in individuals with FASD who seem to have higher IQs than this group, but then there's no that sort of regard for that mitigated sentencing may not be applicable. So it's one of the really strong arguments that.
It's a spiky profile, isn't it? You can
So
have
yeah,
children
absolutely.
with higher, individuals with a higher IQ, and you can have some with a lower. But I guess across
Yeah,
a cohort, it may still come up.
yeah,
Somebody else asked, if our children become involved with the police due to an incident in the community,
yeah.
how should they make sure they are seen as vulnerable to the police to ensure that they are properly supported?
Yeah, to be honest, again, for me, it's just banging the drum as loud as we can. As I mean, definitely, I will give credit at this point to more established researchers who have gone before us, who are, researching this field more recently, who have persevered in the face of, all the adversity and lack of knowledge about FASD. But, we need to continue to bang that drum loud and clear, and just speaking to anyone possible just to understand the level of vulnerabilities. Hopefully, I mean, at some point, of course, we've started seeing the good results, based on the contributions of organizations like, the National FASD and yourselves and other organizations. And we've seen the nice guidelines come out, and hopefully we can get that level of awareness, but it's just to keep shouting and banging, and providing research evidence in the face of I mean, those encounters and the justice professionals.
Um,
It's a difficult question to answer, honestly, but
it is really difficult.
yeah.
I think quite a few people have said, was the outcome of the study what you expected?
Yes, this is again a very good question. So based on before now, we've had so many reviews and sort of anecdotal evidence from parents saying, look, our children are suggestible, they just say yes to everything, they just, accept and things like that. And it gave us that feeling that, all right, if that's the case, we need experimental evidence. And sometimes, of course, qualitatively, we did get all of those themes coming out, but when we measured it experimentally, it sort of confirmed what we had in the qualitative phase. To an extent, I will say, well, it sort of just proved that, I mean, what the parents have been saying, I mean, is corroborating, isn't it? If we experimentally measure it and find out that it was so, I think it sort of meets a level of expectation when it comes to um, the assessment.
Fab. Is there any further insight into how this could play out sort of post interrogation? So, i.e., when attending like a courtroom setting, or if incarcerated and therefore at further risk of suggestibility and vulnerability in a prison setting? Or is that another project?
Yeah, that is really it's another difficult question to answer, because I think one thing that is really useful to do is to provide experimental evidence, research evidence to back up what we theoretically will propose. But clearly, like I mentioned, things like memory distrust syndrome, where the individual knows they have poor memory and they are just hinging to any external cues to just respond to interrogators questioning. I think it sort of provides a context for us to safely assume that there might be actually higher levels of suggestibility post interrogation, especially with this poor memory and the tendency of high anxiety in real life situations, the tendency of impulsivity, the tendency to. One thing I also did measure post this research or after the suggestibility was compliance, but that's the subject of a different presentation, because compliance, suggestibility are very related concepts in the sense that they are, I mean, the individual actually accepts suggestions, but the mechanism by which they accept it is actually different, such that they will just accept it, but then the fundamental belief in the suggestion differs really.
Okay, they're still coming in. There's so many questions. Somebody has asked, can your research link into the Canadian research that has developed into the Manitoba courts?
Well, interestingly, today I was having a conversation with a lawyer. So we have a potential PhD again in FASD and the justice system coming up with our research group here at Salford. And one of the things we know, or from my discussion with this lawyer, is that actually in the UK we don't have any case laws, unlike Canada and the US, New Zealand, where they have case laws. And in terms of case laws, like cases where you can refer to the individuals with FASD, and judges or decision makers can refer back to that and say, okay, based on the premises or the legal argument in this case, it will be applicable in future cases. I think this is something that really needs an attention, or it needs attention to look into, and hopefully we can sort of fit the findings of this research into the court system.
And then I guess just this is like an opinion. Is your opinion on this question? How do you get police to believe that young people are not just making excuses? And what do you think that the police could do differently to support those with FASD? So it's opinion based, really.
Yeah, really. Again, thank you, Joe, for that. It's my opinion again. Firstly, with increased awareness, I know, I mean, there will be that level of consciousness that, well, there's potential FASD in suspects of crime. And then secondly, one of the things we found out is the use of leading questions can be really problematic based on this, the experimental evidence we have. So, I mean, suggesting ideas in the form of questions to try to extract confessions can be really detrimental to young people with FSD. So that level of understanding, I think it will be able to sort of feed into questioning styles and the application of interrogative pressure during interviews within the criminal justice system. Then also providing support. I think for me, I see it as, while there is the issue of appropriate adults or someone in the case of juveniles, I think it may be important to have adults who are knowledgeable about FASD, not just appropriate in the sense of age or anything, but how knowledgeable are they about the vulnerabilities of individuals with FASD? How knowledgeable are they about some of the mechanisms that could lead to, for instance, false confessions or other self-incriminating statements? So I think these are the kind of supports that may be really useful in terms of dealing with individuals of FASD. I hope that has helped or answered the questions at least.
Yeah, I think we've got time for a couple more. This one. So there are already recognised and recommended practices with an evidence base regarding best practice questioning technique that
Yeah,
to sort of reduce the impact of suggestibility, particularly in children. Yet
yeah.
many aspects of the justice system continue to use poor questioning practices, but do not understand how to do this differently. So is there a need to separate out diagnoses like FASD, or is there merit in looking at other complex needs and similar studies really high level of susceptibility to suggestion, or perhaps reach a wider receptive audience?
Yeah, I think this is a very crucial question. Basically, we know that, for instance, in the British system, we we actually many times will adopt the peace method of questioning, which is a bit different from the questioning style in the US. But again, like the person who asked the question said many times, there's still that poor practice of employing um, deception, and there's a lot of research on that, on false confessions and police tactics too. And again, this actually comes to mind. It brings to mind some of the research that has been published in terms of how the justice system would rely a lot on confessions to impact the outcome of cases, which really, honestly, in my opinion, yeah, confessions are really necessary to close cases. But the pressure on, for instance, justice professionals like the police and interrogators to close cases could really heavily impact on the sort of level of interrogative pressure and how interrogators approach questioning. And in terms of on putting together complex needs, I think is quite important because from my research again, I've tried to compare what the results are like for populations with ADHD and autism and FASD. And so far, what the literature shows is that each of these populations are uniquely vulnerable in different ways. So, for instance, the ADHD population is known to be more compliant alongside the ASD population. Meanwhile, my research has shown the individuals with FASD are much more suggestible compared to compliance. So, I mean, based on the conditions, they are like it looks like the pattern of vulnerability is different. It doesn't mean those with ADHD or ASD are not vulnerable, but they are vulnerable in different ways. So I think pushing some of this research evidence in the face of and the justice system and professionals to say, look, we have this experimental evidence. This is what we found so far. Can we sort of change the approach to some of these things? I believe just banging the drum as loud as possible would, just get us somewhere.
Okay, well, I think that brings us nicely to the last and final question. So thank you so much, because it's been amazing, very insightful, and we've had great questions and great conversations in the chat. So I think massive thank you to you, Gilbert. But I think this is a good last question, really. So what plans do you have for your next research project?
Yes, thank you, Joe. Well, at this point, I think one of the things I'm thinking in my head is, like someone rightly mentioned, organizing this sort of training packages for police officers and members in the justice system. But there are a few things really that I'm sort of really wanting to seek funding for. The first thing is understanding the nature of vulnerabilities. So that takes a step further from my PhD in the sense that yes, we found out individuals with FASD are highly suggestible. Now I really would want to assess some of the other factors that are meant to impact suggestibility, just to really deeply understand what the nature of this vulnerability is. So things like coping strategy during interrogative interviews, self-esteem, anxiety, and just like I mentioned again, memory distrust syndrome, and many of the factors that have been identified in past research. I really want to see what is really going on. And it will be really useful. I think we're putting together something just to know how many people with FASD do we have in the UK prisons? Like how many? I believe that will be really useful,
Yeah.
even from the, like I said, from the point of savings and saving the system a lot of cost that can just be just avoided really.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Gilbert. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you with us this evening. Thank you, everybody else who joined us. Just to let you know, we have another webinar on March the 22nd, which is the diagnosis webinar that will be hosted by Barbara Ogston. We've got 4 great guests coming along, including Raja Mukherjee. So don't miss that. Put that in your diaries, put that on your calendar. March the 22nd. And also, I think the big news from the Hub and Adoption UK this week is that we've now launched officially the FASD Hub UK. And it's all been very exciting. Everybody's very busy, and we hope to roll out services and support to all 4 nations and grow our team and grow what we're doing, and look forward to what we can achieve working with the many other great organisations for FASD in all nations. So again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Gilbert. Thank you for giving us your time, sharing your research. Thank you, everybody who attended. Have a lovely rest of the evening, and don't forget to log on and join us on March the 22nd. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you, Joe.